This is an archive edition of Talk of Iowa from IPR News. I'm Charity Nebbe. When we get married or enter into a lifelong partnership, we also become part of a new family, the in-laws. Establishing and maintaining relationships with the in-laws can be challenging. Every family has a history, a family culture, and expectations for the future. These are vital relationships, but they go wrong often enough that they are often played for laughs. Who can forget the exquisitely awkward interactions in the movie Meet the Parents? Here's Ben Stiller's character meeting his fiance's parents for the first time.
Bam, I didn't know you had a cat.
Yeah, I left him here when I moved to Chicago.
Your daddy's found his new best friend.
Really?
You won't believe it. He even taught him to use the potty.
Did? Dad, that's kind of weird, isn't it?
What's so weird about it? Now we don't have to smell kitty litter all the time.
That's right.
Right, Jixie?
That's incredible. So how did you teach the cat to use the toilet?
Well, that was easy, Greg. I just designed a litter box to put inside the toilet, and then once he got used to it, I took it away.
Oh, makes sense.
But I don't think he likes it very much. I mean, every chance he gets, he tries to dig, squat, and bury. I had to move all my potted plants off the floor.
Plus, you got another guy around the house to leave the seat up.
He can't lift the seat, Greg. He lacks the strength in the opposable thumbs.
Yeah.
Ah, right. Imposable. Didn't think about that.
Again, that's a moment from Meet the Parents. Hopefully your in-law relationships haven't been quite that awkward. But this hour, we are going to explore all kinds of in-law relationships with Sylvia Mikucki-Enyart. She is an expert in interpersonal and family communications, an associate professor at the University of Iowa, and she has studied in-law relationships, the good, the bad, and the ugly. Sylvia, welcome back to the show.
Yes, thanks so much for having me.
So, I feel like in-law relationships are something that most of us experience. They are ripe for drama because we are bringing different families together. But I don't think there's been a lot of good research in the past. What made you want to study in-law relationships?
You're going to get me in trouble here. When I started grad school, it was a time that myself and a lot of my friends, we were partnering up with, people who are now our spouses. And I think we all had somewhat interesting experiences with our now in-laws, and it wasn't going as expected or kind of as we thought it should. And so, being kind of the nerd I am, I went to the academic literature to see what was out there. And there is research out there in different disciplines, but there wasn't like a sustained program of research and no concrete guidance of how do we navigate these relationships? There was anthropological studies, studies in sociology, psychology, but how does our communication impact these relationships? And then how do we leverage communication to not necessarily have to make these, the most satisfying, family-like relationships, but to just at least have healthy interactions because these relationships they're not contained. They don't occur in a vacuum, and they have implications for the larger family system. And so when I saw that there was kind of a lack of research out there that kind of focused on this, I just thought, okay, well, let's dig in and figure this out. And then, now almost 20 years later, still at it.
And of course, in-law relationships have been part of nuclear families and extended families for thousands of years. But the way that our culture has evolved has also really radically changed the role that these in-law relationships play in our families, hasn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's one of the big things is that a lot of times, we just focus on the individual in-law in this very micro perspective instead of kind of zooming out and taking this more macro perspective of what is going on here. And when I think of culture and in-law relationships, I think of two types of culture. We have culture with a capital C, which is our racial, ethnic culture, our national cultures. And in the U.S., that culture around in-law relationships is very autonomous. Courtship, or I don't even think the kids call it courtship these days, right? They don't go on dates.
No, right.
Whatever, their situationships or whatever. It happens outside of, our nuclear family. I've had participants in my studies who haven't met their in-laws until their wedding or after their wedding. And so, but other cultures have very specific kind of guidelines for in-law relationships. But in the U.S., we're what we call scriptless relationships. They're very nebulous. So we don't really know kind of how to do them. There's also, and we can get into this more later, a kind of sexist and gendered component to these relationships that really color our expectations, which can then color and impact our behavior and become these self-fulfilling prophecies. And then we also have culture on like a lowercase c, our family culture. Every family is a culture, right? And they have different rules for interacting. What's the sense of humor? How much do we share with one another? What is affection like in that family? And so we're kind of on two levels dealing with kind of cross-cultural communication with our in-law relationships that we don't take the time to, not necessarily take the time to think about, but I guess we haven't been socialized to think about those. And so we just place blame on one individual. This person's crazy. This person's doing X, Y, Z, instead of kind of taking a look and really examining kind of what's going on here.
Well, and because we are so autonomous and we're such an independent culture, we also are forming our own families when we form these partnerships. And so there's not a clear role for in-laws in that partnership, whereas historically, in-laws were incredibly important as, you know, children were born and raised. They were the support system. So is that part of it, too, that people just don't know what they're supposed to be?
Yeah. And I think, you know, like you said, we have this kind of idea now that, you know, it's just our nuclear family. And we've become, it seems sometimes a little bit even more individualistic than we already are. And a lot of times in-laws are thought of as these peripheral relationships that don't have an impact, so we don't really need to worry about them. But anybody who has an in-law knows that they do have an impact and we do need to worry about them. And so I think, yeah, not understanding what our role should be. And then also there's just this proliferation of kind of this like pseudo-psychology on social media now where you have to have boundaries with everything, right? And we've kind of lost the thread on what that means.
Right, what boundaries actually are.
You know, it doesn't mean shutting someone out. It doesn't mean an in-law wanting pictures of their grandchildren or wanting to be included in an event is crossing a boundary. And so, and I get it, you know, there's what we see out there too is so negative. And it gets clicks and it gets likes and, you know, it's way shinier and fun and people can relate to that sometimes more than what in-laws actually typically are is like fairly satisfied, not on either ends of this kind of continuum of super bad or super great second, you know, parent person. But we have this kind of gray area in between. And what do those, you know, look like? How do we establish those and maintain those for that relationship and the health of the whole family system?
Well, tell me more about people being pretty much satisfied with their in-law relationships, because I don't think that most people would guess that given the way we talk about in-laws in our culture.
Yeah, I mean, the first book that was written about in-laws was in 1954, and it was like Evelyn Duvall. And it was basically just, you know, a book kind of ripping mother-in-laws, right? And that trend has continued, where we just see all these negative representations of in-laws. But in my studies, most people are like fairly satisfied, you know, on a 1 to 7 scale, you know, 1 not at all satisfied, 7 extremely satisfied. We're at close to like 5.5 to 6 on that scale.
That seems pretty good.
And that's the average. Of course, you have a couple outliers, but I mean, those are few and far between. And so again, that doesn't, you know, make exciting content, you know, to be posting when you're like, yeah, my in-laws pretty good, or it's decent, or we don't have a problem. And I think we also go in expecting it to be negative because of all these representations. And so we're a little bit hypersensitive to just things that were like normal behaviors that maybe if our own parent said it or our spouse or a friend, we wouldn't think twice about it because it has kind of all that baggage of my in-law said this, then it weighs heavier and our perceptions of it are a bit more negative, which then influences our behaviors.
Let's talk about communication, because when you talked about the small C culture of a family, it seems like communication style is maybe the biggest part of that small C culture. I think I have wonderful in-laws and great relationships with them, but my husband's method for communicating with his family is radically different from my method for communicating with my family. And that has morphed and changed over time. But I think that probably was the biggest stumbling block for us early on.
Yeah. And I think, again, it's something that people don't spend too much time thinking about. And again, even with the communication, there's several layers, right? There's that family history of how do parents and children communicate and their adult children? Like what kind of atmosphere was fostered? You know, are we allowed to express dissent, you know, and have conflict? Are we a family that just, you know, shuts down, suppresses it? You don't push back. You don't say something, you know, to contradict a parent. And so that's one layer, because if a spouse has a problem with their in-law and then they say to their partner, you need to talk to your parents about this, they might think, oh, shoot, I don't know how to do that because we don't talk about this, or this is just how they are, or this is, just how they communicate. And so that could be really problematic. Then you have the parent-in-law and child-in-law, right, who might have then wildly different styles, and maybe jokes don't go over well, or you're a very affectionate person, but your in-law isn't, or vice versa. And like I had mentioned, we're scriptless when it comes to in-law relationships, meaning that like we don't have guides how to do this. Like we kind of know what dating looks like, what marriage is supposed to look like, friendship. But because we don't have these scripts, then we don't know how to have conversations about this. And anytime you suggest, well, maybe have a conversation, with your in-law about this, or more emphasis in kind of if there's a premarital counseling, program going through, what is this going to look like? And people look at you, like you just said the wildest thing, because it's just something that we don't know how to do and are so uncomfortable with. But if we have those conversations that, are going to probably be a little bit awkward, of like, what do you want me to call you? How often do you want to communicate? Should I text or should I call? I think anyone kind of my age younger would be like, please text. I don't answer my phone. What are those? Or like even with your partner, like how are we going to deal with issues that arise? Can I talk to your parents independently, or should you be the one to kind of mediate this? And some of my research has shown that actually parents-in-law often prefer when their child-in-law is that mediator for those kind of, disagreements. But that's also complicated too.
Yeah. Well, we will talk more about that in a moment. We are talking about in-law relationships this hour. With me, Sylvia Mikucki-Enyart. She's an expert in interpersonal and family communications and an associate professor at the University of Iowa. Talk of Iowa is a production of IPR News. Our producers are Samantha McIntosh, Caitlin Troutman, and Danny Gear. Our digital producer is Natalie Dunlap. You never need to miss an episode of Talk of Iowa. You can subscribe to our podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Just search for Talk of Iowa. I'm Charity Nebbe. This is an archive edition of Talk of Iowa from IPR News. I'm Charity Nebbe. This hour, we are talking about in-law relationships. Parents-in-law, mothers-in-law, fathers-in-law, siblings-in-law. When families come together, it can be a challenging experience. And these are important relationships in our lives. Sylvia Mikucki-Enyart studies these relationships. She's an expert in interpersonal and family communications, an associate professor at the University of Iowa. And mother-in-laws are often stereotyped. They are stereotyped as meddling and controlling, often in conflict with their daughter-in-law. Here is a scene from the movie Monster-in-Law, where Jennifer Lopez and Jane Fonda's characters feud as they are soon to become mother and daughter-in-law. It takes place on the morning of Lopez's character's wedding.
Take off that white dress right now, or I'll take it off for you.
Don't you tell me what to do.
You did not just poke me.
Don't you touch me, you two-bit tramp.
Oh my God. Viola, I'm so sorry. I didn't mean to.
You don't go and slap somebody and then apologize. Get some backbone.
This is crazy. Why don't you just face it? I am marrying Kevin today, and there's nothing you can do about it.
You face it. You'll never be good enough for him.
All right, so most mother-in-law, daughter-in-law relationships are not that toxic. But, Sylvia, there is that idea that a mother is losing her child to this new spouse. Mm-hmm. And that is a stereotype we just love to play up in our culture, that somehow the mother-in-law, and in heteronormative relationships and these stereotypes, it's often the mother-in-law and daughter-in-law competing for the affection and attention of the man in the relationship, which seems like a ridiculous idea, but yet sometimes we do see that conflict arise.
I think, yeah. I mean, we have to kind of, again, pull back and look at this kind of broader view and recognize that we live in a culture that has a lot of sexist and gendered ideology that centers men, right? This is no exception, right? That how could someone possibly not, be vying for the attention of this one, singular person? And what we've done is, we see these stereotypes about mother-in-laws and daughter-in-laws that I think reflect how we think of women. They're hysterical, they're possessive, they're jealous. Yet father-in-laws, which aren't represented that much in the media, but when they are, it is the, protector, he could be doing the same behaviors as a mother-in-law, but it's viewed a very different way. And so when we kind of pit these women against one another, one thing it draws on is what is kind of thought of as a scarcity mentality. That women, because there aren't as many seats at the table for women in all, walks of life, that we kind of have to fight for what we get. And even if that means fighting for one another or fighting one another. And so what this does is it kind of, initiates this almost either or mentality. It's either her or me, versus a both and, that we can both love this person and have different relationships, with this special individual in our lives. We can both be excited for this transition and also a little nervous because we don't know what it entails or how this is going to work out. And so then when we see these representations, it really creates these expectations. So you have a lot of mother-in-laws and daughter-in-laws who are entering their relationships already at a deficit.
Right.
Because we think it's going to be negative because that's what society tells us it's going to be. I mean, one look at Instagram or TikTok, experts in quotes on in-laws. And it's all this stuff where it's this vitriol where they're pitted against one another. So we see that, we internalize it, and that really becomes your working model and then influences your behaviors. So if I think my mother-in-law is always going to be critical of me, because that's what mother-in-laws do, they're never satisfied. Any suggestion she has, even sometimes just a benign question, like a genuine oh, what are you doing here, or trying to get to know you, is viewed as she's judging me.
Right.
She's being critical. And so that's the lens. I think of it as literally like a pair of glasses you put on. And these are these lenses that we see our in-laws through. And if we swap out kind of the nasty ones that society gives us and put on these kind of rose-colored glasses, we maybe can give each other a little bit more grace, or at the very least just pause and say, why am I having this reaction? And not saying that this, kind of perspective shift is going to make, every in-law relationship magical, but it is something that I think we are so unaware at the level that these, kind of societal norms and socialization are operating, that we might not even realize how much it is impacting our perception of someone else's behavior and impacting our actual behavior.
Well, that sounds like incredibly good advice for any relationship, assuming positive intent as opposed to assuming the worst in every scenario.
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, it could, and again, there's definitely bad actors out there, right? There are in-laws who might, just have their own issues that they're dealing with. There might be family level stuff that's going on. But I think sometimes if we can just pause and think, what is this like you said, what is their intention? And, what are they trying to do? Or what if I look at this as a positive thing, that they're just maybe trying to share their wisdom or trying to stay connected with me? And there was actually a study done, it was quite a while ago, but it examined daughter-in-laws and their perceptions of their mother and mother-in-law's behaviors after the birth of their first child. The mom could come, do laundry, cook dinner, help with the baby. Perfect, wonderful, great mom, thank you so much.
Hero.
Yes, the mother-in-law comes, offers to do the same behaviors, then it's thought of, she doesn't think I could do it. She thinks I'm not capable of this. I'm a bad mom. I can't keep my house clean. And that wasn't the intention. And it's, again, how powerful those perceptions, are that we have, from kind of this, socialization that we have that can really impact. And then that, of course, impacts our satisfaction with our in-law relationships. And my scholarship, as well as others, has shown that, satisfaction within our in-law relationship does not stay contained there. It affects our satisfaction with our spouse. It affects satisfaction with the parent, adult, child. And so it's really important to try to figure out how we can create just healthy relationships, really, truly for the betterment of the whole family system.
So with the in-law relationship, nobody gets to start with a blank slate because we have these societal norms. We have these stereotypes that we've all been subconsciously trained to believe. But also, we have all seen in-law relationships in action. So, for example, my mother's parents hated my father. It was always a fraught relationship. So I grew up seeing that. Now, my in-laws are great, and I feel so lucky that they're not like my grandparents were. But there's that fear that comes along with, oh, I've observed this my entire life, and now I have my own in-laws. What's that going to be like? So, I mean, you also have these examples in your life.
Right. And I think that's a really good point. Yeah, we have our own kind of family examples, too. And, plenty of participants I've talked to or students over the years when I, teach about this, they'll talk about how that in-law relationship was, how that impacted what grandparents they were or weren't close to. And so I think it's important to kind of have that conversation with your spouse of, what kind of relationship do we want with one another's families, and is that different than what we saw, hopefully, growing up? Or do we think that they don't play a role because we didn't see that, but to our partner, that's very important? Okay, so how do we navigate that? And the thing is, it doesn't have to be like all in right away or at all. And these relationships can change and evolve too, just like we do over the course of a marriage, hopefully, right? We're not the same people or the same couple when we first got married. And these relationships are going to change too. I mean, birth of a grandchild, financial issues, health issues of the parents. I mean, this is going to ebb and flow. And the thing is, like, we just don't have these conversations with our in-laws or sometimes constructive conversations with our spouses rather than your mother this, your dad, this. Right. So if we start focusing on how to have these conversations and how to incorporate our in-laws in our lives, the ways, to the extent that everyone's comfortable, that can really make a big difference too.
So many questions for you. I want to get to a listener question here as well. We are talking about in-law relationships all hour today. And Carrie wrote, she said, my in-laws have maintained the traditions from when their kids were younger because it works for everyone. That's in quotes. She says this includes a meal and traditions after church on Christmas Eve, leading to a gathering that lasts until 10 p.m. Then they have everyone back at their house early, 7 a.m. on Christmas morning, throw in extended family gatherings for both sides of our families on the weekends before and after Christmas, and our immediate family time takes a back seat. I want to create our own traditions and relish these years with my own kids. This has been a problem for me for 14 years. My husband has suggested other dates and times, but gets stuck being the bad guy with his siblings and parents. Am I being unreasonable in wanting to stay home Christmas morning and asking that we find another time for that 7 a.m. family gathering? Suggestions on how to navigate this?
Yes. So any kind of, ritual, celebration, tradition, those are often very fraught, right? Because they're closely tied to our family identity. And so I think, one, it's important to understand that this is something that means this is who we, quote unquote, who we are as a family. This is what we do. Our traditions often reflect kind of our values. We value family time. We value extended family time. And that can be really tricky for people to change. But it is so important that people figure out ways to revise these, because when you get in-laws, you're changing the family system. It's an entrance into it, and things can't totally stay the same. And I don't think the, listeners being,
unreasonable.
Yes, thank you. Yeah. And because it is really important to have your own traditions. And so, like she said, if her partner has brought this up for 14 years, you're just going to have to make the change. And so there's a couple of things when we do need to bring up issues that, we want to change with our parents. And one of the things is using kind of we language, and I'm not sure if this is something the partner has done or not, but we want to do this, we're going to, change this for Christmas, or I want to, I want to
present a united front, or
yes.
At least don't scapegoat the spouse.
Do not throw your spouse under the bus, and so, I want to spend time with my immediate family, on Christmas morning. And then you just do it. Or you just say, hey, this is what we're doing for Christmas this year. I know it's a change. I know it might be a little hard, but this is really important to us. And we want to have this time with the kids. if you want to, then, hey, we'll stop by, later on in the afternoon when this is done. But I think it just has to be you're asserting it and then do it at this point, because obviously looking for some kind of compromise or permission is not going well.
It's not forthcoming.
Right. And so you need to, kind of just do this now after this point.
So I think to go back to sort of the sexist structure that sets us up for conflict, I think one of the ways that becomes really apparent in a lot of relationships is that women do the majority of the emotional labor in a family. So if a mother is used to planning all of the holidays and planning, family reunions and get-togethers and making that stuff happen, and then now their son, again, with a heteronormative relationship, marries a woman who also is going to plan those things and make those decisions. I mean, that is an area I think that is ripe for conflict. And I think that men often just get left out of that conversation or are able to exit the conversation.
Yeah, I think you're totally right that they're able to exit that conversation because we haven't socialized men to be the kin keepers, to be the ones who are doing that emotional labor. So it does fall on the wives, the daughter-in-laws, the moms in their lives. And so then again, too, when we look at that, if a daughter-in-law has a contentious relationship with her mother-in-law, she's not then going to go out of her way, right, to include that mother-in-law in events. And so I think then, too, when we see like, well, you're not coming and hanging out anymore. And it's like, well, what kind of environment are we bringing that person into, and demanding someone's time doesn't necessarily go well. But I think those, trying to figure out what family we spend time with. A lot of my research, it's looked at the areas of uncertainty that in-laws have, parents-in-law, children-in-law, and the spouse. And there's uncertainty about how that dyadic relationship is going to go for sure. But the most impactful uncertainties that in-laws have are about how that in-law relationship affects the family system. And it's that balancing family membership. How are families going to get along? Can we, in ideal scenario, right, both sets of in-laws, extended families all together, everyone's happy, instead of we've got 3 events this day, 2 events this day, right, and then we never get time, for our immediate family.
And so far, we've really only talked about intact families.
Oh my gosh,
so
yes.
Divorce, multiple divorces,
yes,
all of that makes this so much more complicated. If you've got a mom and a stepmom, right, and a dad and a stepdad, and you've already been negotiating that complicated ecosystem.
Oh, yes, 100%. And I mean, even when we talk about the in-law relationship, by its nature, it's a triad. So, a triangle, that's in its simplest form.
Right.
And then you have the other parents-in-law, then maybe step-parents-in-law, then maybe there's ex-spouses who maybe are still, involved in the family. And it becomes really complicated pretty quickly.
I want to read a couple of listener comments here because it's also important to mention that these relationships can be really terrific. Leanne says, I had a wonderful mother-in-law for far too short a time. She would take my very fussy 6-month-old, pat him on the back for an hour to get him to go to sleep, and tell me to go rest in the meantime. So that is lovely. And then there are the stories that get passed down. Bill says, I had a mother-in-law who once gifted my then wife and I $2,000 to help with the down payment on our first house. The next time she came to visit, as she was getting ready to go home, I found her taking pictures down off the walls. When I asked her what she was doing, she said she liked them and reminded me of her gift. That is in quotes. So there are obviously examples of bad behavior that are genuinely bad behavior. But so often to go back around, there are the assumptions of bad behavior. There are the reactions to behavior that may or may not be bad.
Yeah. And I mean, I think, again, that perception, but then also when we do recognize bad behavior, we do have to call that out. And again, it gets complicated, right? Because adult children may have never pushed back on their parents. Their parent might be someone who, made that a very uncomfortable thing growing up. And so to say, hey, mom or dad, we need you to call before you come over, or you need to not use that extra key that was for emergencies to come in whenever you want. even conversations, like that might be so difficult for some folks.
We're going to take another short break. We'll be back in just a moment. We're talking about in-law relationships this hour with Sylvia Mikucki-Enyart. She is an associate professor at the University of Iowa and studies in-law relationships. Talk of Iowa is a production of IPR News. Our producers are Caitlin Troutman, Samantha McIntosh, and Danny Gear. Our digital producer is Natalie Dunlap. I'm Charity Nebbe. This is Talk of Iowa. This is an archive edition of Talk of Iowa from IPR News. I'm Charity Nebbe. This hour, we are talking about in-law relationships. Sylvia Mikucki-Enyart studies those relationships. She's an expert in interpersonal and family communications and an associate professor at the University of Iowa. And again, we know that the really, really fraught relationships, the really bad relationships, may be an exception to the rule. We have people getting a little defensive, Sylvia. Tom writes, he says, listening to today's show has made me feel incredibly grateful for my in-laws. They've always treated me like family from the very beginning. I often tell my wife that I feel more comfortable around her parents than my own, which is really lovely, although it's sad that he feels more comfortable with someone else's parents than his own. But I want to talk about one of the things, again, this is a cultural idea that sort of sets us up for conflict when our child gets married. And you've written about this. It can go both ways, but you've written about boy mom culture and how some people have said that raising a son is like the longest breakup of your life. Tell me why you think this is so problematic.
Well, I think it's problematic because it really, again, sets up these unrealistic expectations and inappropriate expectations for a parent-child relationship, right? We're romanticizing, in some cases sexualizing this parent-child relationship, making it to, and it's called also parentification in the literature of then in those cases, if we're using our child as this emotional support, as a friend, as a pseudo second spouse, whatever that is. And so again, those kind of messages socialize someone to think, well, mom always has to be first, or I can't, be with somebody. And again, it's not an either or situation. We could have close, fulfilling relationships with our parents into adulthood and also still have a close relationship with our spouse as well. And so I think it's just really putting too much pressure and an inappropriate pressure on, this relationship. And then I think it also, part of things that happens too is, again, women are often socialized to just make that mom identity so central to who they are that then when we're investing everything into our child, when they start to individuate and pull away as they should as we get older, that can feel really uncomfortable, and we don't know what to do with that. And so I think there's, a lot of things tangled up in that, but that then just put this pressure when you do find this person, and then you do have these parents sometimes, well, I need you to do this for me, or this idea of I'm owed something because I raised you, something you had no choice in, something that's the job of parenting, right? And then feeling that kind of entitlement, puts a lot of strain on that in-law relationship and parent-adult-child relationship.
Well, we have talked about this in the past, and the fact that parents are, when we are raising children, we're actually hoping that they become independent adults. And sometimes we have to be reminded that we're actually raising adults. We're not going to keep them children forever. But I mean, that can go both ways. I mean, boy mom culture kind of indicts moms there. But we've seen the other side of that. You think about that sort of toxic stereotype of the man sitting on the porch with a shotgun, threatening any possible suitors who come for his daughter.
And again, it's that kind of romanticization and sexualization of this, familial relationship, which is really kind of warped, And then again, just you can have both things. You could have, I'm here to protect you. I'm a safe, home base for you. You could always come home. But I think parents, when you're thinking about in-law relationships, and part of it might be, too, sometimes it's the parents' own relationship, their own marital relationship, right? But you would hope that as a parent, I want my son to go to, like, I want, if he, partners up with somebody in the future, I want that person to be their go-to. That needs, the good news you hear, that should be the first person. The support you need, the first person. We're always here and we're, back up for it for sure. But I want that for him. And I think, understanding that both things can exist and it's not trading one off for the other. But again, that idea that sons kind of, leave their parents, and there is, an old quote that, a daughter's a daughter all her life, a son's a son till he takes a wife. And the data does support that because the men are drawn into his wife's family, again, because of the kin-keeping responsibilities and emotional labor. And so, but if you create an environment where you're, being inclusive of your child-in-law, and you've made an environment where your adult child wants to hang out with you versus feeling obligated, I think that creates a much better environment to have these healthy relationships where you do sometimes even feel more comfortable with your in-laws than your own parents.
Well, I want to talk about the shift that happens when kids come into the picture, too, because a lot of the conflict is generational. When you talk about your relationship maybe not mirroring the way that the relationship that your in-laws have with each other, that can be a source of tension. But also raising kids at least a generation after your in-laws or your parents raised kids, that can cause a lot of tension because the way we raise kids has changed dramatically. And not just because of cultural norms, but because we have actually learned a lot about how to keep kids safe, too.
And I think when we get into that area, especially with the parenting and the changes, it's hard. Again, I keep talking about identity, but so much of this is rooted in identity, too, and who we think we are, right? And parents, the grandparents or in-laws, can sometimes see it as this, like, personal affront. If we say, we're doing something different, or the parent says, well, that's not how I raised you, or we did X, Y, Z and you turned out fine. And if the adult child and in-law says, well, we don't want to do it like that because of, research that we know this doesn't work well or whatever, or hey, mom, dad, that actually didn't do, that wasn't a good thing because now I've got this, issue with whatever it is. And parents, and it's understandable. You take that as an affront of, oh, I guess I did a bad job. I'm the worst parent there ever was. Instead of understanding two things can be true at the same time, right? Like I was doing maybe the best I could under the circumstances and the knowledge that I have. And there's a different way of doing things now. And so I think, again, there's just so much sensitivity because so many of these issues seem like then I'm being implicated in something.
Criticism.
And I think that's really tricky. And even then for young parents, right? Like none of us know what we're doing, but then you're even more sensitive. So even a bit of advice or a story of when your spouse was younger can then be seen as this criticism when it's not intended to.
Let's go to the phones. Randy's on the line in Cedar Falls. Hi, Randy.
Hi, how are you?
Good. What would you like to talk about?
Well, when my wife and I were first dating back in the early 70s, the first time I was invited over to dinner to her parents' home at the time, we had dinner, and after dinner, when my wife and I, girlfriend at the time, were leaving, I said, "Do your parents always argue like that all the time?" And she said, "Oh, we're not arguing. We're having a family discussion." And that's what we did at my house. I mean, our big thing was keep the bread off the floor because we had such a small kitchen, and that's all we talked about. But the other unique thing that happened over the years, because my wife and I have been married 54 years now, and that is how our parents became best friends. They couldn't wait for holidays and birthdays so that they would get together and be able to see each other again. And there were times that they would even go out to eat together without my wife and I even knowing. And it was just a beautiful thing to see happen over the years.
Oh, that's really lovely, Randy. Thank you so much for sharing that. And I don't think we have time to talk about in-laws' relationships with the other in-laws this hour. We also could spend a lot of time talking about sibling relationships because sisters-in-law, brothers-in-law, that can also be an interesting, it can also be a supportive, it can be lovely, it can be fraught, it can be difficult. I want to, because we only have about 9 minutes left, I want to talk about advice. So let's talk about what if you are becoming an in-law. what should you be doing? What should you be thinking to try to make that relationship work?
Yeah, and I think it's good. There's definitely different advice, right, for the parents-in-law and the children-in-law. So for a parents-in-law, I mean, first, I think a big thing is to know that this relationship is starting when they're dating. When your child brings this person to meet you for the first time, assume that they may be in your life for a long time. Because what I see is a lot of parents-in-law, especially kind of, generations, kind of a little bit older, tend to see marriage as that transition point. Like now you're finally in the family, even if you've dated for a decade, lived together, whatever that is. And then they somehow think this relationship can maybe change now, even though maybe I didn't treat you well for 5 years. But now that we're officially family, blank slate, let's start over. And that's not how it works, right? Because that lays the foundation. So
it's all still there.
Right. So from the beginning, start, just assume that this person will be in your life and act accordingly.
And at that point, older parents sometimes still think that they have maybe some control over who their child chooses. And that seems like a very dangerous thing to weigh in on your child's romantic relationship. Even if you think you know better, if you show your cards and say that you're against this relationship, that it could haunt you forever.
I mean, yeah, it could. Then they're with the person and they're like, I know you don't like them. It could maybe push them towards, the person more. And I think one of the things is like, unless it is a very toxic or genuinely abusive relationship, you don't know, the kind of relationship you want might be very different than what your child wants. Or we sometimes think we know our child best, but maybe we knew the version of them when they were still living at home the best, and we don't know them as intimately now. And things have changed, and their desires and wants and needs, have changed. And so I think, keeping your mouth shut is important, unless it is some very red flag behavior. Right. I think trying to develop a relationship with that child-in-law independent of the child, don't just make it that in-law relationship that everything's through what we call the linchpin, who is the child-in-law. So, initiating taking them out to lunch or coffee, getting to know them, texting, occasionally, and then also it's okay to ask what those kind of boundaries are. Hey, is it okay if I shoot you texts? Or, if you see something that you think they'd like when you're out, maybe pick that up and kind of gauge that reaction. Try not to take everything super personally, because you were probably once a young person establishing their own family too. So I think giving, again, just a little bit of grace, understanding kind of where this is coming from, but then maybe having those conversations and not of like, yes, everyone comes to my house at 7 a.m. on Christmas morning, right? Instead, hey, this is how we celebrate the holidays. What does your family do? What do you think would be a good way to develop new rituals and routines? And it is important to incorporate these folks into rituals and routines as well, but also create something new, because that is what's happening when you do gain a child-in-law or a parents-in-law. You're creating a new family system as well.
When you say giving grace, I mean, that seems to be, again, the foundation to not assume the worst in people's actions and their words, although sometimes that may be there. Let's talk again a little bit about how a couple navigates. You mentioned that linchpin relationship. So, I mean, sometimes the conflict will be between the child-in-law and the parent-in-law, not the blood relatives. And that biological child or part of the nuclear family will just step out of it because they don't want to deal with it.
Right.
That doesn't seem very fair, does it?
No, and it's not. Yeah, and so that linchpin can play a huge role in this relationship. They can make it or they can break it, and they could help facilitate this. I mean, one thing is you are kind of this tour guide to your spouse into this new culture of your family that they're entering. And that's a delicate balance, right? Because we don't want to dismiss problematic behaviors. And sometimes families do, right? Well, that's just how they are. That's how they've always been. They won't change or whatever. That's not going to cut it with some things, but you can kind of explain like, hey, maybe my mom or dad act this way because this is what happened kind of in their childhood, or this is, the thing that happened. But then also that spouse, their loyalty does have to be primarily now with their new spouse, that child-in-law, or I'm sorry, the adult child. So they need to kind of call out parental missteps, bad behaviors. They need to be the one that are initiating kind of any boundaries or rules. And like we said, not scapegoating their spouse, using that we language. If there's a problematic incident, focus on a behavior, not like the person, not, Mom, you're always so selfish.
Right.
Or, when you did X, and it's called the XYZ statement that John Gottman has kind of coined. And, when you did X in situation Y, I felt or we felt Z. It takes, it's a complaint, not a criticism, and it's not becoming personal. And then just nipping things in the bud. Don't wait till kind of all these resentments build. And then you have a laundry list you take to your parent of, 10 things they need to improve on. So, take care of them as they come up.
We have this email from Chelsea. I always start my mother-in-law conversations with, I got the good one. It was my husband who didn't. And when I reflect on that, it comes back to how the parenting worked. My mother-in-law is welcoming and has built trust, asks questions, but is never questioning. She taught me the saying, it's your home, you live here, to remind me not to deep clean just for her arrival as I used to. She raised her kids with that same tone, and they now both parent with that same tone. My relationship with my mom was contentious, and her role as mother-in-law, grandmother as well. It's taking a lot of generational unlearning to parent differently myself than to continue how I was raised. That's an evolution a lot of people go through. But I'm also hearing Chelsea saying, I want to be the parent I wish I had. And that's good advice for parent-in-laws too. You want to be the parent-in-law you wish you had, right?
Yeah, and I think, you'll have people who will complain about how their in-laws were, and then they're repeating the same patterns, with that. And again, that first step is that awareness and that self-reflection. And sometimes there's uncomfortable truths that we kind of have to confront. And I think, with this comment and then the man who called, someone, whatever, who said they felt more comfortable, with their own in-laws. That's, I think, something really neat and interesting to see that can also be a point of tension, too, is sometimes we see things in our in-laws that we like, that were kind of negative in our family. And then when we want to change that in our own family based on what we saw in our in-laws, that can be a point of, kind of tension there, too, but also a really great opportunity.
Sylvia, thank you so much. This has been so much fun and enlightening as well.
Thanks so much for having me.
Sylvia Mikucki-Enyart, she is an expert in interpersonal and family communications. She studies in-law relationships and is an associate professor at the University of Iowa. Talk of Iowa is a production of IPR News. I'm Charity Nebbe.